Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Point of View, and we certainly do welcome you to this program here today. We're going to spend some time over the next 2 hours covering a lot of different topics. We'll be looking in the next hour about the issue of big government and some of the aspects of what we talk about so often here on Point of View. We'll have James Payne with us as we talk about that. We're going to get into, in about a half an hour, some of the other issues in the news. What's been happening at the border? What about Border Patrol and some of the criticism the president has lodged against them, which I think is very unfair. Over 3,000 doctors and scientists have signed a declaration accusing COVID policymakers of crimes against humanity. We're going to talk about that as well. We'll get into some of the election audit out of Arizona and also the FBI's role in January 6th. A lot of these stories are being covered in the mainstream press, but we're going to give you some perspective on it maybe you haven't heard before. But before we get to all of that, you know that how often we like to emphasize movies and films that you can go to that are family friendly and really many times emphasize many of the topics we address here on Point of View. So we, with that in mind, bring to you now a conversation we're going to have with David White. He's been on the program with us many times before, an actor, a producer, filmmaker, probably best known for the God's Not Dead film series. And there's another one coming out, God's Not Dead, We the People, and it is a franchise that has been very successful, but it gets into some other conversation as David White plays Reverend Dave Hill. And David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's, for anybody that's not familiar, and imagine most of our listeners are, the whole God's Not Dead franchise has become pretty significant over the last couple of years, in which we've had a chance to really highlight a lot of issues in your films that we talk about so often here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been... obviously, the first God's Not Dead movie came out in 2014, and I think just, certainly shocked Hollywood. Our whole point was became the number one independent movie of that year, independent live action movie of that year. And, and the goal was to just open up conversations about God at that point at the, on the college level, on the college campus level. And then it moved into the high school level and then into the community. And this one really takes the conversation of God and freedom of religion to Washington, D.C.
And again, that's one of the topics we address so often here on Friday, a weekend edition. We have usually Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty. Last week we had Lathan Watts. We do talk about this issue of religious liberty and what is taking place there. But there are some really important topics that are surfaced here because in this particular case, again, you represent a pastor, but you really take us into the real heart of some of these religious liberty battles. Without spoiling all the aspects of the film, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, it's basically it centers around this sweet homeschooling co-op that is run by my character's church, and we get a visit from the county, basically saying that if you don't comply to the curriculum that we are presenting and giving to you, forcing you to use, then we will fine you every week. And so, like in the vein of that wonderful, if you remember that old Frank Capra movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Sure.
This group goes to Washington to defend, our case, basically. And they're trying to take God out of our curriculum that we're using, there for the kids. And so, we didn't know it at the time when we made it, but boy, for such a time as this, and no doubt.
Well, again, we have talked about this before, where you have Christian colleges being told now that because of an executive order written by the president, your view of sexuality can't be implemented, so we can have not only same-sex and opposite-sex dorms and bathrooms and showers, but back to the issue of curriculum, that because you teach particular views, we will not allow you to have access to certain kinds of facilities and things of that nature. And so in some respects, even though this is fictional, it is very realistic. And if I understand from what I have been able to hear so far, you play the David Hill, who actually even goes and testifies in Congress. So talk about that for just a minute, because this is another one of those aspects of which we probably will be seeing more and more of that in the future, as there's attacks on various pastors, attacks on various Christian schools and other things, that the people that will be called to testify are the people that actually become victims of some of this discrimination.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's interesting because when you deal with homeschooling, right? At the beginning, I've never homeschooled my children. I didn't quite understand what even homeschooling was. With my, but obviously last year with the whole COVID. We all learned about homeschooling because we had to do it. We had to teach our children, and they had to. They were online, some of that, but in reality, I have a whole new respect for parents who teach their children and understand how some kids, they thrive more when they have that kind of teaching as opposed to going to a school, a different school. And so, what's interesting is that I didn't know much about the Common Core, way of education. And as as we've learned more and more about this, they're taking God out of the whole educational system. And so, and that's really at the root of this. But we go to Washington, D.C. to stand before Congress and basically plead our case and say, and it becomes bigger than this. There's a great quote in here from Ronald Reagan that says, basically, freedom is a fragile thing. And once a generation loses it, they never get it back. And I think right now America is at this place of contention, of trying to find itself. At the same time, there's been all this pressure to remove God out of the school systems and out of the curriculum altogether, and to forget about it. And I have this great line in there that says, "Don't forget about the people who fought and bled for our freedoms." And those, could be taken away at a moment's notice before we even realize it. And I think it's in motion and happening, obviously, as we speak now.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some more details. But let me just alert you to the fact this is going to have a very limited release. And so we're going to talk about when it will show up next week. So we want to give you a week to kind of put this on your calendar, plan it out, begin to think about getting tickets. You know what I've suggested before. These kinds of films are perfect for not only you to go, but maybe now we're letting you know a week ahead of time. You can actually tell your Sunday school classes coming Sunday, hey, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we can go to this. Why don't we all go together, or buy tickets and then distribute them to those individuals? So when we come back, we're going to talk about this limited release. And this is a great opportunity, as we've talked about so often, to take a fictional story, which is really very close to reality. And sometimes that's a wake-up call. When we talk about these issues, people kind of yawn and they go, yeah, that'll never happen. And then all of a sudden, we're starting to see how these are been very, very successful. And we talk about apologetics, but it's one thing to see God is not dead in terms of what was happening in the previous film. We talk about some of the issues of high school students and see you at the poll and all sorts of things, and that shows up in a previous film. This one brings us to a topic we address so often, religious liberty. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with David A.R. Wright right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we need to help the next generation learn to navigate the culture. And that is why I'm so excited that John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel have written the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. The rowboat on the cover reminds us that this emerging generation will have to navigate through choppy waters. John was on my radio program recently to talk about the book and share his experiences from Summit Ministries and the Chuck Colson Center. Both of the authors have ministered to thousands of students and their parents. They're facing a range of challenges, from digital media to pornography to drugs to transgender issues. They not only focus on the hot-button issues we hear about and read about every day, they focus on the undercurrents in the culture we often miss. Those would be consumerism, materialism, addiction, the sexual revolution, racial tension, extended adolescence, and the key principles of wisdom and virtue. On our radio program, we also talked about the challenges the millennial generation face, especially in an age with greater hostility towards Christianity. They also must do so in a digital world that moves much faster than in previous generations. This book will equip them and their parents to address many of the cultural issues other generations never had to consider. Another helpful aspect of the book is the attempt to answer or refute many of the cultural lies in our society. Technology helps spread these lies quickly. Christians will need biblical discernment to deal with so many lies that are assaulting biblical truth. They say that young people can either celebrate, create, confront, co-opt, or correct cultural trends and habits. Obviously, we must stand for biblical truth and correct cultural trends, but we also must do it with love and compassion. This book provides a model for all of us to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking with David White about this new film, God's Not Dead, We the People. And if you were listening last week, of course, we had our Truth Team week, and you might remember one of the conversations that we played between Michael Ferris, who at that time was the head of the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund, who today, of course, is the head of Alliance Defending Freedom. But he was talking about in the 1990s, there was a piece of legislation, it was called H.R. 6, and it was going to actually provide incredible government interference and oversight over homeschooling. And you might remember him sharing the fact that he came on with, at that time, Marlon Maddox was the host, and Penna Dexter and I sometimes served as co-host in that particular situation. We encouraged people to call Congress because we were very concerned about that, and it generated such a response that it almost shut down the phone system there in Capitol. And so if you say, this idea of the government interfering with homeschool, nah, that's never going to happen. No, that happened a quarter of a century ago, and that really is the theme of this particular film, in which Reverend Dave is called upon really to defend a group of Christian homeschool families and goes all the way to Washington, D.C. And so it provides, if you will, a fictional story that is a little too close to reality and surfaces some of the issues we talk about so often here on Point of View in terms of religious liberty. So, David, let's, if we can, talk about when people can watch this, because it will be in the theaters next week. It's limited release, so that's why I wanted to give it a week for people to know about this, maybe contact people in their Sunday school class, go out and buy tickets, and really make a splash, because as I said before, we want to send a signal to people in Hollywood that we really want more of these kinds of programs. But talk about what we can do to support this film.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It's every time you guys, your audience decides that they want more of these type of films to be released and to go out there, the biggest statement is by buying a movie ticket. And that's basically casting your vote, saying, we believe in what you guys are doing. And I think these messages are so important to put in our theaters, to go, not only here in the United States, but worldwide. And so we're doing a limited release October 4, 5, and 6. And if you don't have it in the theater near you, just go to godsnotdead.com, and then that can show you where, the closest that you can get it, or you can hopefully try to get it to your town there. So October 4, 5, and 6, it gets released.
And one of the things I appreciate about that is there's a section there for theater and tickets. And of course, I always go in and type in my zip code, and up pops a whole bunch of theaters, and that's the case. There's a section there for group tickets, and then one that says bring to my church. So first of all, I would encourage you, if you can at all make your way to the theater that is nearest you, I would encourage you to do that. But then there are other opportunities where indeed you could even host this. If you want to see the trailer, it's about 2.5 minutes long, starts out with a quote and speech by Ronald Reagan. I think most of our audience would really appreciate that. But again, it's important to make your way into the theater, but if they can't, there's some other ways in which they can show that in their community or in their church, isn't there?
There is, yeah. And I mean, all of that is on that website, but I mean, right now, if you can, go to the theater first and foremost, October 4, 5, and 6. And, the movie, I'm excited about the movie because obviously, it is definitely, it has, politics in it. It's set against Washington, D.C., that backdrop. But at the core and the heart of the God's Not Dead movies, our goal first and foremost is to entertain, that people, become inspired when we make these films that uplift and inspire your faith. And the cast is, we have a wonderful cast involved. We have some of the characters from the previous movies coming back. We never dealt with Aisha and her father, and where did they go after this? And I'm excited to show that. Martin's coming back with, with the whole China thing that he had. And then what's interesting is Isaiah Washington is our new person to this franchise. And of course he's just wonderful. And there's just so many wonderful people that are part of this, this world, and excited to. I think you guys will. It's a standalone movie, so you don't have to have seen the other ones first, but obviously it's more fun if you have.
Let me just mention real quickly, for those of you that are pastors or maybe Sunday school teachers or others, we have also, there's a link to press release. There's a kind of one point sheet. There's a production notes and a number of other things that would be very helpful. And you will certainly recognize some of these actors, including the judge in this. And so I think you're going to find it very helpful. And what I think is so striking is that each time you come out with one of these films, it's one of the things we talk about here on Point of View. A while back, of course, we talked about the arguments for the existence of God, and we've talked about how to respond to what you may encounter when you go to a college classroom and where somebody may be challenging your faith, and your film helps that. I can't count the number of times we've covered over just even this last year the whole issue of religious liberty, the issue of homeschooling. We have, of course, booklets on the subject. We have all sorts of resources. We do interviews on it. And so this is just one more very creative way to maybe educate some people in your congregation that are not aware of some of these issues, because you can go watch the film. Then lots of times we bring our Sunday school class out to a restaurant and we have kind of an ongoing discussion that takes place. We've done sometimes, David, where we actually get enough seats in the particular venue where when we're done, we just kind of almost have a spontaneous conversation there where everybody's kind of sitting in their seats and kind of lead some of this. So there's some very creative ways in which people can learn about this issue of religious liberty and at the same time maybe educate some members of their congregation that aren't quite as familiar with some of these issues.
Yeah, it's also, it's amazing the different stories that come out of the God's Not Dead, over the years when these films are released, and the different experiences that people have in the theaters. I remember one person, somebody had it was like a heart attack almost that they had. And, and the audience stopped the movie. They basically went into, they prayed for the person. They ended up, almost having a worship service there, as that person was tended to. And it just was like one of those moments where, that person was okay at the end of it all. And more importantly, people were just encouraged in the faith in different ways. And, that's the beautiful thing about a theater is it as much as, we're so used to with COVID and stuff and getting away from people. It's a community. It's like a church, and there's so many stories from obviously people with their kids and people coming back to the Lord through these movies. And I'm grateful and humbled to be part of them. And I think this one will not disappoint either. We wrote this actually after the second one. Chuck and Kerry wrote the first draft. They were the writers on God's Not Dead 1 and 2. And it just didn't feel right about that time. It's obviously we do a lot of prayer over them to say, Lord, when do you want us, what do you want us to tell? What story do you want us to tell? Because we don't want to walk in our own strength and our own, and then for this, we started working on this before COVID, and we felt like this was what we were supposed to go into. And started reworking the script and getting it to the place. And then all of a sudden, obviously COVID hit, the thing got pushed. This movie was pushed back so much, until we could finally shoot it, when COVID had cleared a bit. But, the amazing thing is that it couldn't be more timely or more relevant now than it is.
Yeah. Very timely. And again, some of the things we've been talking about here on Point of View. So, David, again, appreciate all the work that you've done. We have links to it on the website, and we want to encourage as many of our listeners to show up Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Great opportunity. And again, we have links to not only his Twitter page and Facebook page and all sorts of others, but of course to God Is Not Dead, We the People. Let me take a break, but just before we do so, let me just mention that last week, of course, we had our truth team, Unchanging Truth, God's Unchanging Truth in a Changing World and Culture. We did okay, but we still have some very significant needs. So if you did not involve yourself last week, let me just mention the fact that we still have a banner up for a few more days, which is entitled Unchanging Truth. And if you can join with us, especially on a monthly basis, we certainly do have monthly needs. So if we have monthly income, that matches up. And there's still quite a bit of room for you. We have not done as well this fall as we did last year. So obviously, if you can help us out financially, we would appreciate that. Of course, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. Of course, the pledge line number is 800-347-5151. Did want to give you an update, and we're still in need of your financial support. So if you can help us out and you've been waiting, I'd love to hear from you. Let's take a break, though. There are a lot of other issues in the news, and we're going to be talking about that. And all of that will be coming up. If you want to find some more about this particular movie or about joining with us of Truth Team, simply go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, get into some of the issues in the news. Quite a bit to cover, and I probably won't be able to cover all of it in the half an hour we have before the top of the hour, and then we're going to spend next hour talking with James Payne. His book is The Big Government Love to Hate, Exploring the Roots of Our Political Malaise, and he is an individual that is taught political science at all sorts of prestigious institutions and universities, so we'll be talking with him for quite some time. But our first article here comes from the editors of National Review, and I love what they say. It said, after saying nearly a discouraging word about the Taliban as they chased us from Afghanistan and held us to an exit deadline that meant abandoning American citizens, green card holders, and Afghan allies behind enemy lines, President Joe Biden has finally found a focus for his moral indignation: Border Patrol agents on horseback. I wasn't going to talk about this, but there have been so many other people that have, because first of all, it is a false charge. It is a classic example of fake news, and yet it is something that just simply has a life of its own. The editors, first of all, say the thing to say about this is that the charge is complete fantasy, concocted on social media and amplified by a lazy or complicit media. Of course, you know the claim about whips and whipping people and striking people and all the rest, which is not true. And as they point out, anyone paying attention or with an interest in the truth knew that no one was whipped in Del Rio almost immediately after this became a trending topic. But Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, for days have pronounced themselves outraged for an alleged horrific image anyway. And of course, you have then the statements being made by the president. Now, the bottom line is that, first of all, by trying to keep individuals from crossing into America is, of course, if you will, the actual responsibility of Border Patrol. Second of all, there is nothing inherently wrong with someone on horseback, but now, of course, the argument has been made that we will no longer allow the Border Patrol to use horseback, something that actually has been around since, I found out, 1924, which the animals are very adept at maneuvering on the terrain, which is oftentimes fairly difficult for motorized vehicles or for agents on foot. This is a good example of how the press just keeps it going, and then the administration keeps it going, even when I would imagine most fair-minded people know that it's not true. But another way to look at this is to do what I do so often when we talk about logic. Let's just for a moment assume that one border agent did do something that was inappropriate. Okay, let's concede the argument. Does that then allow you to completely complain about everybody who is a Border Patrol agent? No, there are tens of thousands of Border Patrol agents. Even if somebody had done something wrong, that should not reflect negatively on all the rest. Now, you might say, well, then why is there such an exclusive focus on that? Well, it's called misdirection. Harry Houdini would love this, because the argument is when we focus on something that didn't happen and show our outrage, it ignores the fact that, of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security announced the other day that we have at least, and I think this is a low number, at least 12,000 Haitians that have been allowed into America. Some of them are walkaways, some of them are runaways, most of them simply were processed and released into the United States with the idea that eventually they're supposed to come back and come for a court date, and you know how few of those will actually show up. And so instead of focusing on something that frankly would affect all of the listening audience here, you're going to be much more impacted by thousands, and I don't think it's 12,000, but we'll use the 12,000 figure for just a minute, of Haitians that came into your community or other communities. Those individuals have a greater impact than what one Border Patrol agent might have done, which they did not do, but it reflects everybody's attention somewhere else, allows people to be outraged when the people that should be outraged are the fact that we had almost 20,000 Haitians there under that international bridge in Del Rio. And there are more coming, because if you see what happens to those people who then get processed and go into America, is there any deterrent to keep the rest of those individuals in Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, all the way others maybe already in Mexico right now from crossing the border? And I think you know the answer to that. So that is the first story that we've put on the table, and it is, again, just something that almost doesn't deserve attention, but because so many people spent time talking about it, we thought we would at least give you a little bit of perspective on that for a few minutes. Let me now cover a story you probably have not heard about. Sometimes our goal here is to take a story you've heard about and maybe give you some perspective you hadn't heard before. This is a story that you probably have not heard about. It's our second story here, and the title is Over 3,000 Doctors and Scientists Sign a Declaration Accusing COVID Policymakers of Crimes Against Humanity. This is what's called the Physicians' Declaration. It was actually produced by an international alliance of physicians and medical scientists condemning the strategy that's been used in many countries, not just the United States, to treat COVID, and actually accuse these policymakers of potential crimes against humanity for preventing physicians from providing life-saving treatments for their patients, and actually, as we've talked about before, suppressing open scientific discussion. You may remember there was another group of about 6,000 criticizing some of the things in this country, but this one has, I think, even greater potential, because what you had were a group of physicians and scientists that met in Rome, Italy, and they actually had a 3-day global COVID summit to really begin to address some of these issues. Now, their argument has been this: at a time when you did not have in many of these other countries even a vaccine, then at least you could have not suppressed some of these other treatments, these therapeutics that in many cases showed some kind of promise. And so as a result, that's why they're making such strong statements about it being a crime against humanity. If you want to read the entire document, we have posted it on our website. It, first of all, tells you about the story of when this conference took place from September 12th to the 14th, and what it did in terms of giving many people in the medical community, medical professionals, an opportunity to compare studies and to actually assess the effectiveness of some of these kinds of treatments. Because after all, we may sit here and say, well, we've got a lot of vaccines and a lot of people have been vaccinated, although there's some that are not. But the bottom line is that if you are in many of these countries where you don't even have access to the vaccine, then at least a treatment that would mitigate some of those effects would be very important as well. And so they talk about how there were attempts to actually end people's career, character assassination, censoring research, censoring papers, various social media accounts which were blocked, search results which were manipulated, clinical trials and patient observations sometimes that were banned, and a number of other things. And this is really, if you will, a very dark chapter in the history of medicine, and it was in many cases generated by a great deal of politicization that took place. And so I wanted you to know about this declaration. If you would like to know more about it, you can go to our website, which is pointofview.net. Deborah Heine is the one that is writing about this, and it includes, so that you can read it, the entire declaration. There are, just a full page of whereases, as you would imagine, and then some therefore be it resolved. And of course, the function of this was to say, wasn't the goal of most medicine, and especially the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm? Well, indeed, that's supposed to be the case. And then they give some examples of where this was actually prevented because of various kinds of political action. Now, does that mean that everybody that actually was involved in preventing some of this information from getting out was a mean-spirited individual? quite frankly, a lot of them probably thought they were doing good, and that some of these kinds of therapeutics, some of these kinds of treatments might have been more dangerous. Some of them did it because they wanted to use this particular lockdown as a way to control the society and move forward the Great Reset. So there's a lot of different motivations for why people did this, but this is an attempt on the part of some very prominent doctors from various countries to simply say, you know what, we are very concerned about this, and we actually are very disturbed by some of these COVID policymakers. And as a matter of fact, the person that wrote some of this and actually read it, Dr. Robert Malone, he's the architect of the mRNA vaccine platform. So it's kind of hard to say he's just kind of some wacko out there, some quack. And so we wanted you to know about that, and it's on our website, pointofview.net.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that at the top of the hour, Dr. James Payne will be with us. He has his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He's taught at Yale University, at Wesleyan. He's taught at Johns Hopkins University, Texas A&M, and his book is entitled The Big Government We Love to Hate and the Roots of Our Political Malaise. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But in this last segment, before we talk with him, I did want to, again, talk about this issue of discernment. And that is, if you read the New York Times over the weekend, you'll see an article that came out in the New York Times, but I want you to understand how to maybe make sense of it. And that is, sometimes the New York Times, when they see something coming down, maybe use their articles to try to maybe downplay an issue. A good example of that is last week, New York Times reporters trying to get ahead of the fact that the Clinton campaign lawyer Michael Sussman was going to be indicted, did a story about that to kind of downplay that as well. And so it's not surprising that then on Saturday, the New York Times published, if you will, a kind of carefully constructed bombshell. You can read about this on our website, pointofview.net, because Julie Kelly said what it was intended to do is kind of soften the blow of what I'm now going to tell you. And that is, it is very clear now that the FBI actually was part of the individuals that came against the Capitol on January 6th. Now, the careful part of this is don't overplay that, but at the same time, don't underplay that, because they've already at least acknowledged that there was one informant among the group of Proud Boys who marched on the Capitol on January 6th. And so they admitted that among the FBI assets there, quote, may emerge, further complicating the picture of Proud Boys activity on January 6th, because what they see is that there were indeed some individuals who were actually part of all of that. Now, I certainly love the way Julie Kelly put it. It won't necessarily complicate the picture of Proud Boys participation as much as it will complicate the groupthink, she says, shared by the media, by Democrats, by even the never-Trumper Republicans, that the FBI played no role in organizing or perpetuating the attack on the Capitol. And that is something that has been reported in the past by various individuals. Matter of fact, last week I think I quoted from Angelo Codevilla, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, about some of that. But now you are having at least sort of the recognition that, yes, FBI was involved. Now, we don't want to overplay that and say everybody was involved or this was from start to finish an action by the FBI, but it certainly kind of sets aside the argument that you people that are saying the FBI was complicit, you're all wrong. Well, now we know a little bit more, and that article coming out in the New York Times, I think, was a way to sort of soften the blow of what maybe some people already knew was true before. So again, if you want to have some discernment, don't overplay it, but don't underplay it as well. Here's another one. The New York Post is now claiming vindication over its scoop back in October of 2020 about the Hunter Biden emails. Remember when we found the Hunter Biden laptop? And, of course, the argument was we're not sure it's his laptop, although no one really denied it was his laptop. And then very quickly you had all sorts of individuals that attacked the New York Post for arguing that and even suggesting that really what you were dealing with here was some kind of Russian disinformation. And you might remember that then you couldn't even see the New York Post's article or its Twitter post because all of that was taken down. And so now here we have that after we were told that this was nothing more than Russian disinformation. And might I also add one more thing? On October 19th, 2020, if you got a good memory, there were 50 former intelligence officers that signed a statement that actually said that this was a good example of Russian disinformation. Well, you might say, well, what's new? Oh, it would be the fact that a writer for Politico has actually published a book about President Biden, and that it confirms that the emails on the laptop actually belong to Hunter Biden and are indeed authentic. So again, the New York Post are saying, well, yeah, but when we were trying to get that information out during a campaign, we got shut down. And I think, again, this is an attempt to say, when we all look back on this and say, we maybe had a really corrupt media, maybe we need to have a few stories that argue that, well, maybe that was true and we made a mistake, so that we don't look like we're always on the wrong side of history. So here's another example of something we talked about at the time where we said it was sure that this was Hunter Biden's laptop. We're sure that these emails show complicity with China, and now, of course, it comes out. Now, we can speculate all day of why that's even coming out right now. It could be that this might be used later on to encourage President Joe Biden to step down. All of a sudden, we've discovered that maybe he has a little bit of problems with mental acuity. Maybe we've now discovered that he and his son have too many ties to China, and this would not be good. And maybe that's that. Maybe it's something else. But there is one more example of where you just have to have a little bit of discernment when you see what's in the news cycle. One last one, and I did want to mention that, is out of Arizona. Of course, we've had audits taking place, and the audit being argued right now by one side of the aisle is that there's no harm, no foul, because the cyber ninjas looking at the audit concluded that, if anything, Joe Biden may have gotten 360 more votes than were actually tabulated in Maricopa County, Arizona. And again, here's an example where you don't want to go too far because, as you might imagine, former President Donald Trump said, we have 20,000 ballots that appear to be cast by people no longer living in the state. Okay, well, you don't want to overreact, you don't want to underreact, because some people are saying, see, it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. But if indeed those 20,000 could actually make a difference in a state where Joe Biden actually won by 10,000 votes, what about this? Well, you can go back and look at those numbers. They're actually 23,344 mail-in ballots. They didn't have people at that address. Does that mean they were out of state? Not necessarily. They might not be phantom voters. Unfortunately, we recognize that some people do move, and maybe they didn't take the time to file their change of address filings. And we do know of that 23,000, 15,000 stayed in Maricopa County, but they may not have been at that address. So again, and of course you have college students, sometimes they might pick up the ballot which was sent home instead of the one where they're going to school. So you don't want to overplay that, as the former president did, but you don't want to underplay it either, because what you have right now are a lot of people in the press saying, you know what, they counted the votes, and actually Joe Biden would have actually gotten more votes. And I'm saying, yes, but we still have 23,000 ballots that are at least questionable. And they say, well, it wouldn't make any difference. And I come back with my favorite question. How much voter fraud do you feel comfortable about? Obviously, some of that might have been voter fraud. It may not have made a difference in this election, but next time it might make a difference in that election. And then to argue that we can't have voter integrity laws because, after all, when we counted the votes in Arizona, it didn't make any difference. Well, this time maybe it didn't. Next time it might. And it's a good illustration, again, of how people are just a little too cavalier about some of the possibilities of voter fraud, and how critical they are sometimes of people that say there's a good way to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And it's things like photo ID, checking the addresses of individuals that vote, and making sure that we have integrity in the voting process. So those are just a few topics we have addressed very quickly in the half an hour that we had. We come back, we're going to talk about this new book, The Big Government We Love to Hate, and maybe understand a little bit more about why government isn't always the solution. Sometimes you'll see it's actually the problem. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoint's commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is The Big Government We Love to Hate, which is the title of this book that I think you are really going to appreciate. But let me, for just a minute, especially for our younger audience, let you know that there was a time in which there was a lot more optimism about the ability of government to solve problems. And during, for example, John F. Kennedy's reign, there was this idea that maybe government will be the solution to all of our difficulties. By the time you get to, of course, Watergate, then the interest and the belief that government would be the solution to our problems began to wane. And Ronald Reagan, in his inaugural address, says, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And yet, even after that period of time, and even after we have seen so many government scandals, many of which we've talked about on this program, and other failings of the government, even though people are convinced that government is the problem, they still always tend to look to the government for solutions. So we're going to talk about the rise of failurism, which is a new word, I suspect, for many of you, and really get into this in more detail. And to help us out, the author of this book, The Big Government We Love to Hate, Exploring the Roots of Our Political Malaise, comes from Dr. James Payne. He is an individual that for 18 years taught political science at Yale, Wesleyan, Johns Hopkins, Texas A&M, but then decided eventually to resign his tenured professorship and actually moved to Idaho, and he joins us now by phone. So, Dr. Payne, a delight to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Kerby.
I appreciate the work that you've done in this book. I might just mention it's 10 chapters, and it's over 200 pages, very readable, and so you don't have to necessarily major in political science to understand this, but it is, I think, one of the most interesting ironies that if you ask people, do you think government does a good job of providing services? Think of your maybe getting your driver's license or going to the VA. Oh, people would just roll their eyes. But yet, whenever there's a problem, we're always convinced that government is the solution. And you have been exploring the fact that on the one hand, we know government is really able to do and needs to do some very important things. But in most cases, trying to deliver goods and services, that's not something that the government does very well.
Right. Well, and actually regulating many areas of conduct. You and I can say, it's too bad that people are doing this or that, like they're overeating or drinking alcohol and so forth. But and we've brought government into these things, and it doesn't work. The attempt to control behavior through government is systematically a failure. But people don't seem to learn from that experience.
And I think sometimes we've even called this the Bloomberg effect. Michael Bloomberg can't really necessarily, when he was mayor, get the streets plowed when there's snow. So instead, he'll spend some time talking about global climate change. He'll talk about big gulp drinks and those kinds of things to take people's attention away from that. And we recognize how politicians do this right now. We just in the last hour talked about whether or not there were actually border Border Patrol agents whipping Haitians, but that's just to keep people from thinking about the fact that we just allowed 12,000 Haitians into the United States. But what about the average American? Because we do have sort of, as Americans, and this is what you talk about early on in your book, almost kind of a love-hate. We have, on one hand, faith for big government, but at the same time, we also seem to have disdain for big government. Can you sort that out for us?
Yes, it's difficult. That's what the book is about. And it's a relatively modern thing. And in times past, even as recently as, say, the 1950s or 60s, you didn't have that much direct information about the politicians and who they were. Television was a main factor in changing this. And so the opinion, polls show this, the opinion of the public about government and confidence in government and government leaders, proportioned corrupt, and the polls show that they're increasingly negative about government and government officials. But it turns out that there is a deeper faith in government that goes, it's underneath all this. In a way, it's kind of like the wife comes into the psychiatrist and she's got a bloody nose and husband beats her up and he says, well, you should just leave this guy. And she says, I can't. And that's kind of parallels what we've got going with government here. This people can point to plenty of times when things they know about that are disappointing, but they have a deeper faith that this will underneath should work, could work, will work if we get the right person.
You know, one of the things that I write about in one of our little booklets on the Understanding the Liberal Mind is how Friedrich Hayek, in his book, The Road to Serfdom, warned us that, people oftentimes have good intentions. Bureaucrats have good intentions. But when a bureaucrat has good intentions but doesn't have expertise, they can make mistakes. Also, when the bureaucrat or the politician can benefit from certain kind of policies, then you're not going to necessarily act in the best interest of individuals. Yet our people that tend to be on the left tend to still be convinced that the best way to deal with problems is to have a bigger government, even when almost every piece of evidence we have suggests that the bigger the government is, the fewer rights and freedoms you have, and sometimes the greater problems you have because of either intentional or unintentional bureaucratic regulations.
Right. That's the problem. Is one of the things going on here, and it goes all the way back hundreds of years to Marx and so forth, is what I call the power illusion, which is the idea, and it goes back to even Plato, that if you got control of the state, which is the forces of violence, this is the cops, the guns, aircraft carriers, and so forth. If you've got control of that, then you are very powerful. And if, therefore, your ideas, you have good intentions, and you have this power, then it has to happen. The good thing has to happen. So it's that, of course, horribly oversimplified is what the problem is, but this power illusion keeps coming back so that each time you see a bad regime, or a regime you dislike, you feel, well, let's get that out of there. And then the one I like will come in and do everything perfectly.
Doesn't quite work out that way. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about this idea of failurism and some of the elements of it. It's probably a new word for you, and I think you will certainly appreciate some of the material that we'll be covering. Let me just hasten to add that you might say, I have never heard of this book. Well, it came out a couple months ago. The Big Government We Love to Hate, Exploring the Roots of the Political Malaise. It came out earlier this year, and so we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. You might find it in your local bookstore, but I think the simplest way is to actually just order it online. And as I said, about 200 pages, 10 chapters. We're going to kind of work our way through some of this. And if you have maybe friend, neighbor, coworker, or especially a college student coming back and thinking the solution to every one of our problems is to make government bigger, this is a book that would be a good antidote to some of that. So we're going to come back and talk about this idea of failurism and some of the other aspects of the book with Dr. James Payne. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we need to help the next generation learn to navigate the culture. And that is why I'm so excited that John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel have written the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. The rowboat on the cover reminds us that this emerging generation will have to navigate through choppy waters. John was on my radio program recently to talk about the book and share his experiences from Summit Ministries and the Chuck Colson Center. Both of the authors have ministered to thousands of students and their parents. They're facing a range of challenges, from digital media to pornography to drugs to transgender issues. They not only focus on the hot-button issues we hear about and read about every day, they focus on the undercurrents in the culture we often miss. Those would be consumerism, materialism, addiction, the sexual revolution, racial tension, extended adolescence, and the key principles of wisdom and virtue. On our radio program, we also talked about the challenges the millennial generation face, especially in an age with greater hostility towards Christianity. They also must do so in a digital world that moves much faster than in previous generations. This book will equip them and their parents to address many of the cultural issues other generations never had to consider. Another helpful aspect of the book is the attempt to answer or refute many of the cultural lies in our society. Technology helps spread these lies quickly. Christians will need biblical discernment to deal with so many lies that are assaulting biblical truth. They say that young people can either celebrate, create, confront, co-opt, or correct cultural trends and habits. Obviously, we must stand for biblical truth and correct cultural trends, but we also must do it with love and compassion. This book provides a model for all of us to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. James L. Payne. He is the author of the book, The Big Government We Love to Hate, and one of the chapters that you have there, Dr. Payne, is the rise of failurism. And you might, if you will, kind of give us a definition. And then you've got a number of elements that are part of this idea of failurism.
Right. This is kind of a new type of political book that emerged, the first one in 1991, and emerged in about that time, and really has since flowered and flourished. The thesis of it is that government is not working now. That it worked well in the past and did the right things and was to be proud of, and now it's kind of messing up. But the interesting thing about it is that all of these authors, and there are at least several dozen in this category, still want to use government to fix things. That is, they are not conservative or libertarians at all about government. In fact, they criticize libertarians. They really still have faith in government in spite of being very against it. Like one of the first was called The Death of Common Sense. This is Philip Howard, How Law is Suffocating America. And his thesis is that rules and regulations are a mess. And he has lots of specific examples of very dysfunctional results. But yet he doesn't advocate backing off from rules and regulations.
So again, that is part of the problem, is that there's sort of this default that says government is there. It's society's way of solving problems. And so even though in my heart of hearts, I know that when I've been in the Department of Motor Vehicles line, or when I've been waiting for a callback from the VA, or when I've complained about the Postal Service, and again, not to criticize any person working in those areas, but you know as well as I, there are examples of people that have been very frustrated with what are oftentimes seen as government services. They still, nevertheless, are convinced that the solution to the next series of problems, whether it's climate change, health care, or whatever, needs to be government. And so in some respects, that's kind of that idea of failurism, that even though I may be disappointed with government and disappointed with some of the structures, disappointed with the way in which some of these policies are made, I still keep having this incredible hope that someday we're going to finally get it right and solve all of the problems that we are dealing with in our society. Is that fair?
Right. And, well, and another aspect of it is the feeling that government has to be the problem solver is so deep that you'll often hear the phrase, what else is there? In other words, you can point out that a certain policy is dysfunctional, like, say, something like Social Security, which I deal with there. It turns out Social Security ends up really costing everybody much more money than just saving for your own retirement. But people can't seem to get away from the idea that the world would come apart unless this program were in place. Or another one, by the way, is public education, government-funded, government-directed education. Amazingly, 200 years ago, we didn't have it. And people put together education systems by churches and families, and Benjamin Franklin founded a school, and it had a scholarship program. Had nothing to do with government or taxation. It worked. But this idea that government has to be in everything, and government knows best and so forth, took over. And you started building up at every level the government education system, which we're now deploring, but people can't seem to quietly say, well, let's just phase it out.
We can maybe talk for just a minute about what is government to be. I mean, you are a professor of political science and have had that. You have a very good question in one of your chapters, is government likely to be a good problem-solving agency? So maybe we come back to basics here. It does seem to me that just before you play a game, you have spring training, you get back to basics. It seems to me that before we get in any deeper into what political science can happen or what government policies can happen, maybe we just need to be asking a fundamental question that maybe you can answer. What is the function of government? Why do we have government in the first place?
Well, probably the real answer it is a tribal tradition that goes back quite a few thousand years. The feeling that we are a tribe and we need something that's in charge of this tribe and that speaks for the tribe. And that's where that faith comes, okay? Nobody sat down, this is rather astounding when you think about it, sat down and said, we've considered having or not having a government, and we have listed the properties of government and so forth and decided government is a better deal. Nobody does that. It's just there. It's automatically there in your thinking that, oh, you just got to have it, and nobody thinks twice about it.
One of the things that I found so interesting in your book, I almost started laughing out loud, is what is called the post hoc logical fallacy. And again, I guess it wouldn't be a good Kerby Anderson talk without at least some Latin phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is basically after this, therefore, because of this. And the classic illustrations that's used so often is that when the sun comes up, I hear a rooster crowing, so it must be that the rooster's crowing causes the sun to rise. Now, we all see the fallacy of that, and you might say, how does that relate to government? And I thought this was great that you talk about this. Something good happened, government was present or had a law or program in connection with that good result. Therefore, government caused the good outcome. And maybe that explains why people still have this incredibly naive hope that government is the solution, because, after all, every once in a while we do get somebody in the government schools that's well educated. Every once in a while we do get somebody that goes through government-run health care that does well. And so all of those good examples illustrate that the government policy and the government programs are actually good in the first place.
Right. Well, but the problem is, on those, you've got to do an extensive cost-benefit analysis. Sure, government can run a school, but by my estimates, just taking the money part of it, government schools cost 3 times as much per student as a private school. There's just acres of inefficiency and waste there, not to get to the spiritual and creative aspects of education. But yeah, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. But what drives it is, if you have a basic belief, then you use that belief to explain things. And this is what the people would do in the old days, say, of rain gods. If it rained, they would say, see, it rained, therefore the rain god took care of us. He did what we asked for. And it's the same thing. A good example, I quoted, this is the fellow that was the head of the security agency, U.S. Security Agency, wrote a book called Your Government Failed You, in this failurism genre, saying it failed. Like he's documenting how it failed on this to block the terrorists in different ways. But as he's writing along, he said, I knew as a child that Franklin Roosevelt cured the Depression, and that if we hadn't had the New Deal with him, the Depression would have lasted years and years longer than it did. A perfect example of the post hoc ergo propter hoc. In other words, there was a government, it said it was trying to fight a depression, and he assumes that it succeeded, that it did its job.
But again, a good example of the fact that it didn't. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a little bit more of some of the logical fallacies that lead to people absolutely convinced that even though the government has failed, next time it's going to get it right. And of course, you hear that argument sometimes on socialism. 25 failed socialist experiments that have all failed, but yeah, maybe next time we'll get it right. So we'll come back and spend some time with him. By the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, feel free. Dr. James Payne with us, and if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Well, I'm giving out a phone number. You know, one of the things we've encouraged you to do, especially last week during Truth Team, is to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And if you appreciate some of the conversation, even that we're having today, can I ask you to go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that banner that says Unchanging Truth. We've talked about God's unchanging truth in a changing world and culture. And there is an opportunity for you to make a gift, and we have had an okay Truth Team week, but not a great one, and it's kind of put us in a situation where we certainly would need to hear from some of you. So if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate that. Go to the website, pointofview.net, and find some of that information. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with James Payne right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Continue your conversation today with Dr. James L. Payne. The big government we love to hate, exploring the roots of our political malaise. One of the other examples you use in there, Dr. Payne, is Derek Bach, who was, of course, the president of Harvard from 1971 to 1991. He wrote a book called The Trouble with Government. And so he recognized, of course, some of the disappointment that many people, including those at Harvard and the Kennedy Center for Government and everything else, have, and with the idea of big government. But at the same time, he was still convinced that they could actually, if they were to just maybe come up with the right policies, the right personnel, eventually be able to turn all of that around. And of course, I guess you don't write a book by saying it's always failing and it's never going to get better, but it is amazing that when you have a book called The Trouble with Government, you still don't at least acknowledge some of the inherent limitations of the federal government or the state government in able to solve some of the social problems in our world.
Right. And what the next thing you should do is offer some recommendation about phasing out or trimming back your dependence on that institution. If you go to a restaurant and you have a bad experience, you come out saying the food tasted terrible, you will tell other people not to go there. But that's not what's happening in the case of these failures that I've called it. That they're very strident about criticizing government and how badly it works and how dysfunctional it is. But they will not say, since it's dysfunctional, we should use it less. They don't say that.
One of the things that relates to this is an article that I wrote a while back just about the idea of the deep state, because you had a lot of people saying, oh, there's not a deep state. And I'm saying, oh, come on. When I was at Georgetown in government, we were talking about the Iron Triangle. We were talking about how individuals move from, for example, congressional committees to interest groups to the bureaucracy. We've talked about how, in some respects, there's such institutional drag. And it was interesting because everybody made fun of the idea that Donald Trump said there was a deep state until just about the time Joe Biden came into office. And then you had this article that appeared in the Washington Post saying, you know, is this deep state left over by Donald Trump going to make it difficult for Joe Biden to succeed? All of a sudden, then they discovered the deep state. But a lot of this comes back to the conversation we had just a few minutes ago in terms of the fact that you have individuals that were warning us a long time ago about the possibility, Friedrich Hayek, for example, The Road to Serfdom and others, that when you have people coming into the government, even if they are well-meaning, they just simply don't have as much knowledge and feedback mechanism that you have in the free market to actually come up with a policy that would certainly fit the entire nation. And so whether it's not having expertise or the problem of one size fits all, it seems to me that federal bureaucracies always have a problem, especially when the number one goal oftentimes for a bureaucrat is to make sure that he or she gets enough funding for the next fiscal year, right?
Right. Well, that point I think is well established for those who want to pay attention to it, that in terms of running an economy, making economic decisions, government is a very unsatisfactory agency. But you mentioned Friedrich Hayek. He's cited in the book. I don't know if you noticed this.
I did notice it, yes.
Well, he comes off as a supporter of most of the welfare state programs, including government education and like government disaster relief and so forth. A long list of the government programs he endorsed. And so I look at his thinking very closely and find that what happened is, even though when you talk about economic decisions, you manufacturing shoes, the economists can see there's a lot of decisions we make there that government agents won't be able to do very wisely. But then you think of other things like education, which is just a general term, and you haven't studied it and haven't looked at the classroom and teachers and what so forth. Well, you fall back on this assumption that government is the agent that can solve problems. You assume government can take care of education or health care or disaster relief. What happened was Friedrich Hayek did not carefully study disaster relief, education, medical care, and so forth. And so he fell back on the assumption that I'm talking about here, that government can do it okay. So it's kind of sad to see that someone who went so carefully into one limitation, one area where government is limited, didn't stop to realize that these limitations he was identifying applied to all other areas.
Yeah, he didn't follow it to its logical extension. He was concerned about what, of course, you have today, the British health system and some of that. But as you point out, it surfaces in a variety of different areas. But I did want to, even though there's a lot in the first 150 pages, I thought there were some really valuable things in the appendix, which is relatively short, but it also leads to what I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking about. Okay, you guys, you're supposed to be so smart. You're talking about all these problems. What are some avenues of reform and evolution, and how can we deal with that? And one of those you mentioned is cost benefit. That's something that we do every day, theoretically, in a free market. There are individuals that are making decisions about how many products, how many services, how to price it, and everything based on a variety of feedback mechanisms that happen in a market. And yet, when we come to things like, as you said, government, public housing, welfare, health care, and the rest, we almost never do anything like a cost-benefit analysis. And it seems to me that if we were just to require that at the state level or even at the federal level, it might begin to force us to trim back some of those programs.
Well, right. We have. The interesting thing is, as I point out there, that there have been a lot of cost-benefit analysis. I've done some of them, but there are many other people, and in many cases they have been, you might almost say, accidentally purchased or accidentally mandated by government itself. And the result of these cost-benefit analyses is almost inevitably, I have to say, all the ones I've ever seen, dramatically demonstrate that the government program is wasteful, inefficient, and should be discontinued. But the fascinating thing, so the cost-benefit analysis are out there. Yes, they need to be more popular, made more publicity for. But it turns out they are not that powerful in changing the average person's mind. And now we get back to the point of my book, because the average person has this deep, deep faith in government. So that this one finding is, oh, well, maybe it happens there, but it doesn't really change their deep faith in government.
Yes. Well, and the other part of that is, again, I quoted Ronald Reagan before, but the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. So even though we can say that some of the programs that were implemented to address, rural electrification or dealing with certain kinds of childhood diseases that no longer exist, or a variety of other topics we can come up with, then there's some kind of goal succession, sometimes policy change to keep them going. And how many times on this program have we documented, for example, the waste and inefficiency and fraud in things like Medicare by Dr. Merrill Matthews and others, and yet they still continue on. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about some other ones. One, of course, is cost benefit. Of course, you can't get a change if people are going to keep a program even though they know it's inefficient. We also want to get into common sense, because that's another thing you talk about, and decentralization, a couple of other topics, because these are issues as well to address this growing governmental idea that indeed every solution to every problem is a government solution and a government program, and that is certainly not the case. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about this book, And I have a few people I'd like to pass it on to as well. Click on a picture there, and we have a picture, again, of James Payne. And just click on the book picture there, and you will see that it's available in paperback, very inexpensive, and yet takes you through some incredible stories, as well as lots of logic and facts and figures that will help you understand that, you know, as I said before, government many times is not the solution. Government sometimes really is the problem, and it is, by definition, sometimes very inefficient. And there is no attempt sometimes to reform programs that always have a constituency. So we'll come back and talk a little bit about that and how we can use common sense, decentralization, a couple of other topics to address this issue of big government. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just give you kind of an overview as well for the rest of the week. Penn and Dexter will be here tomorrow because I'm going to head out to California. We're going to be doing a live remote from KYCC in Stockton, California on Wednesday, and looking forward to some opportunities to meet some individuals. And we'll be back in the studio by Friday and cover some of these stories once again. So each day, we're going to be covering different topics. And today, of course, our topic is big government. And if you would like to know a little bit more about this book, we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. The guest, Dr. James L. Payne. And Dr. Payne, let's, if we can, talk about some other solutions. We talked about cost-benefit, but also you talk about common sense, decentralization. Can you give us some ideas? Because as government gets bigger, not only is it inefficient, but I am noticing, and maybe that's one of the reasons why you decided to move to Idaho, that government is becoming more intrusive. And if we start getting to a point where government is going to do social credit scores on us like they do in China, if big government and big tech are going to determine what we can say and what we can't say, I'm a little bit concerned about the growth of government, not only in terms of the fact that my tax dollars are going to something that isn't working very efficiently, but also it can be used as a weapon against me in terms of my freedom. So what are your thoughts?
Right. We have a large area to cover here, but I think we're making some progress, and I see it. Education is a good field here, and just in the last couple of years, where the number of homeschooling and private schooling and type cooperative stuff, people are beginning to see. I mean, the average person is beginning to see that the thing called public education is not a satisfactory system. And I think we are moving away from that, although there's quite a powerful lobby of, the educators and so forth that are trying to keep that going. But I think on point after point, we're finding that if government is getting in our way, we can, in our own small way, go around it or find an alternative to it.
Well, I think we're going to have to. And one of the things that this pandemic and lockdown has done is, Dr. Payne, we've had a number of parents actually watching what their kids are learning on the computer and going, you got to be kidding me. I mean, this is not exactly Civics 101. These young people can't tell us what the three branches of government are. They don't know when the government actually began. They don't know what's in the Constitution. Sometimes they have trouble adding two figures together. And yet they're learning a lot about everything from critical race theory to the fact that this is an evil country and that we are certainly guilty of all sorts of various kinds of evil. And I'm not minimizing the fact that some of that is indeed part of our history. But they've just sort of been appalled at the level of sexualization of our children, the lack of good quality education of our children, and the promotion of almost any kind of educational fad. And so that, I think, is going to even hasten the departure of many parents and their kids from the public school system, don't you think?
Yes, I see that happening up here in Idaho. A lot of people I talk to reacting just as you say against these things.
So, again, what would you recommend as we let you go to this book? Because I know you wrote it in part to actually just get off of your chest all these things that you've struggled with over the years as being a professor at some of these institutions. But I also see this as a very useful book to maybe wake some people up who, on the one hand, recognize that government probably doesn't do too many things very efficiently. I mean, after all, the government should protect us from foreign invaders. That's called the defense and Homeland Security. Government should do a few things to make sure that we do have a system of laws that are implemented. But in a lot of other areas, government has far exceeded what the founders and the framers intended. And so in some respects, I think your book is really written for individuals to pass on to someone who's just convinced that the answer to every problem is to just have another government policy. Is that kind of why you wrote the book?
Well, no, I don't think they'll even read the book. I think they're too far gone on this. Actually, I wrote it more for the conservatives who are mostly in my camp, but they don't realize how deep the attachment to government is. And one way to start testing that is you can ask people about taxation. And you'll find there the famous quote, Supreme Court judge, of taxation is the price we pay for civilization. Oliver Wendell Holmes, that is, said that,
yes.
Judge. That I think has to be disagreed with, because taxation, which is the initiation of force to collect funds, is the foundation of government. So if you really want to question government, you have to start questioning taxation. And I don't find today very much interest in this, even among conservatives. It's they feel taxation is just perfectly fine, and once you accept that without any question, you're on the road to big government.
Well, we've talked about how there is hard for some of our young people, especially if they've never had any history lessons, to know that there was a long period of time before we even had something like the income tax and how it was implemented and all of that. And that's something I've written about in some of my books and some of the articles as well. But I appreciate you giving us some time today talking about your book, The Big Government We Love to Hate, and appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
I enjoyed visiting with you, Kerby.
Let's just, before we take a break, mention just one last time that this last week we had, of course, our Truth Team. And if you go to our website, Unchanging Truth, you'll see all sorts of information about the way in which you can join with us. And I'm hoping that even though we are done with our Truth Team last week, I just thought I'd mention just before we say goodbye today, because we did not have as good of response as we would like. And I recognize that there are a good number of you that maybe have been adversely affected by first the pandemic and then the lockdown and all sorts of other challenges. So we certainly encourage you to certainly give us your prayer requests, and we can pray for you. And I know that that may be the situation for some of you, but I also know there may be some others that maybe God has blessed you and you can help us out financially. So I thought before we move on with all sorts of other topics, I would just mention at least one last time that you can go to the website, which is pointofview.net. Click on that banner that says Unchanging Truth. If you scroll down, you can see you can join as simple as $1 a day, $30 a month. We were mentioning all through the program that we think the sweet spot these days is $50 a month, because that's where you receive, of course, the Outlook magazine, the various booklets I've been referring to today, your choice of a canvas messenger bag or a leather laptop bag, and those are resources we want to put in your hand. But I know some of you have joined at the $100 a month level, and that includes all of those things, the magazine, the booklets, the bag, but also a collection of what I think are the best books of the last year or so, interviews that I've done. I mentioned one of those, which was Live Not by Lies. Another one, We Will Not Be Silent. These are books that we thought were so good that we went out and bought copies of those books to put in that bag for those of you that might join at $100 a month. So whether you could support us as $1 a day or $50 a month or $100 a month or a one-time gift, I would just encourage you to do so if you have not responded. We did not have as good a week as I would like to have had, and of course that is something we have to make decisions about and adjustments about. And you've had to do that with your family. You probably had to do that with your business. We'll have to do that here at Point of View as well. So if you can help us out, we do greatly appreciate that. Even though we're going off the air, you can call the pledge line number. It's 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Of course, the website is pointofview.net. I want to thank Doug for stepping in today as our engineer, and Steve as well. Penadexter will be sitting in this chair tomorrow. I will be sitting in a chair in California as we do a live remote from our good friends at KYCC. So have a good day. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.